Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome for the first time, depending on how far down the YouTube rabbit hole you've drifted tonight. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab that blanket that still has crumbs from last week in it, and let's drift together into a world where bedtime wasn't just about Netflix autoplay or scrolling TikTok until your eyeballs burned. Number 500 years ago, bedtime was a whole different production. Spoiler, it was colder, smellier, and involved way too many fleas. Now, when we say bedtime in the 1500s, you might be imagining some rustic candlelit romance. Maybe a lute playing softly in the background. A queen brushing her hair 1,000 strokes. Disney style. Yeah, no. Real bedtime back then was equal parts survival strategy and community theater. First of all, the bed itself. For elites, a bed was basically the medieval version of a status symbol. The bigger and more ridiculous, the better. Think heavy oak frames carved with more saints than the local cathedral, curtains thick enough to smother an ox, and mattresses stuffed with everything from goose feathers to whatever plant material was available. Poorer folks? They were lucky if they had a wooden plank with straw, sometimes just the floor. Very character building, apparently. And here's the fun part, beds weren't just for sleeping. In the 1500s, your bed was also your office, your dining table, your sick ward, and sometimes even your public stage. If you were rich, people literally came to your bed to ask favors, talk politics, or watch you die. Yes, deathbed scenes were basically the medieval Oscars. Everyone wanted an invite. But let's rewind to the actual going to bed part. Forget switching off the lights. Electricity wasn't a thing. People relied on candles, oil lamps, or if you were really poor, the natural gift of stumbling into furniture in total darkness. And because candles were expensive, people often didn't bother staying up late. Once the sun went down, so did everyone else. Interestingly, many people back then had something called segmented sleep. Yeah, basically, instead of one long 8-hour block, they often slept in 2 shifts. You'd go to bed not long after sunset, sleep for a few hours, then wake up around midnight. This in-between period was called the first sleep and second sleep. And what did people do in that midnight gap? Oh, all the classics. Pray, read if you were literate and had enough light. Or, more commonly, sneak over to your neighbor's bed for some extracurricular activities. That's right, medieval booty calls time perfectly with circadian rhythms. Now, about those bed sheets. Linen was the standard, but let's just say washing frequency wasn't winning any hygiene awards. Bed bugs and fleas were practically part of the family. People genuinely believed fleas were a normal part of life, like roommates you didn't really like but couldn't evict. In noble courts, there were even flea combs, like special grooming tools to deal with the inevitable. Imagine giving your crush a flirty look while scratching your leg raw. Romantic. Speaking of romance, beds were also political tools. Royal marriages often started, or ended, in bed. The consummation of marriages was a public event. And no, not that public, but public enough that witnesses had to confirm it happened. Nothing says sweet dreams like your uncle peeking around the bed curtains to give the thumbs up. But let's float back to the peasants for a second, because their bedtime experience was a different vibe. They often shared beds with multiple family members. We're talking mom, dad, 3 kids, maybe grandma, maybe a pig if it was winter and the barn was cold. It wasn't cozy so much as a human livestock lasagna. And yes, this made privacy basically non-existent. And then there were night clothes, or the lack thereof. Some people slept naked. Others wore long shirts, which doubled as daytime undergarments. Pajamas as we know them weren't really a thing in Europe until they were imported from the East much later. The idea of sleep fashion was basically don't freeze. Of course, dreams were taken very seriously. People thought dreams had prophetic meaning, so that midnight wake-up period was often a time to reflect on your subconscious visions. Dreaming about bread? Great harvest ahead. Dreaming about pigs? Uh-oh. Dreaming about your neighbor's wife? Time to confess. Now, we can't skip over the role of religion. Bedtime prayers were a big deal. People went to sleep genuinely worried that they might not wake up because, plague, fire, or just life expectancy being garbage. So they'd pray hard before bed. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, wasn't just a nursery rhyme, it was a survival strategy. And finally, the royal elite. They took bedtime to an art form. Beds with canopies, silks, embroidered pillows. Some kings had entire teams of servants just to get them tucked in. Imagine being paid to stand around while your monarch slides into bed like a toddler who refuses to sleep. That was a real job. Called the groom of the stool in some cases, though that delightful title covered other, less glamorous duties as well. So, bedtime 500 years ago wasn't cozy Pinterest boards and fairy lights. It was cold, crowded, itchy, and occasionally religiously terrifying. But hey, at least it had character. And fleas, always fleas. So, we've covered the basics of medieval bedtime, the segmented sleep, the flea-ridden sheets, the shared beds that doubled as pet hotels. But bedtime wasn't just about lying down and trying not to itch. Oh no. Like everything else in history, it came with rituals, class differences, and just the right amount of uncomfortable weirdness. Let's start with the nightly ritual of actually getting into bed. Today, we just flop onto a mattress, maybe scroll a bit, then pass out. 500 years ago, bedtime could be more like an endurance sport. First, you had to stoke the fire, or at least make sure the embers wouldn't die in the night. A cold room meant frozen toes and, if you were unlucky, frost on the inside of your blanket. Yes, that happened. Then, if you were in a household with servants, someone else would do the fire stoking for you. Nothing like the luxury of outsourcing basic survival. Climbing into bed wasn't simple either. High-status beds were literally high, so much so that you sometimes needed a stool or small ladder to clamber up. Because what screams power more than a mattress elevated like a sacred altar? Look at me, peasants. I can sleep 2 feet closer to heaven. And then there were the curtains. Beds often had heavy curtains around them, partly for warmth, partly for privacy, and partly because nothing says romance like draping yourself in what amounts to a portable sauna. In noble houses, these curtains were embroidered, decorated, and probably smelled faintly of mildew. Closing the bed curtains was a legit ritual, almost like tucking yourself into a small, dusty tent. Now, speaking of warmth, let's talk about bed warmers. These were metal pans filled with hot coals, slid under the sheets to make the bed cozy. Sounds great, right? Except, of course, that setting your bed on fire was always a risk. Nothing like drifting off to sleep, wondering if tonight's the night you become a cautionary tale. Still, bed warmers were popular because freezing half to death was somehow worse than possibly combusting. And we can't forget chamber pots, because yes, getting out of your cozy flea nest in the middle of the night to wander down to some drafty outhouse was not happening. People kept pots near, or sometimes under, the bed. Privacy? Minimal. Odor. Let's just say it was an acquired scent. In wealthier households, chamber pots could even be silver because nothing elevates the human experience like peeing into precious metals. But bedtime wasn't just about physical comfort, it was also social. In big noble households, servants might actually sleep in the same room as their masters, on pallets on the floor. Because why should you ever be alone even in your most private moments? And if you were royalty, your bedchamber could be practically a public space. People came and went at odd hours, delivering documents, asking favors, or just standing there awkwardly while you drooled on your pillow. In fact, the French court took this to an absurd level. The king's bedtime and waking up routines were practically public ceremonies. Courtiers competed for the honor of helping the king take off his socks or hand him his nightshirt. Imagine fighting for career advancement by being the best at passing pajamas. But hey, when you live in a world of rigid hierarchy, every sock counts. And then there's intimacy. You might assume people would at least get some privacy when it came to, let's say, bedroom activities. Not always. Royal consummations, like when two important families married off their kids, were sometimes witnessed to make sure the marriage was legit. Witnessed, as in other people were literally there to confirm the deed. Nothing says passion like your new in-laws hovering in the background. Meanwhile, peasants just carried on with their bed-sharing chaos. Whole families squeezed together on straw mattresses, and yes, that often included livestock in the same space, particularly in winter. It made sense. Animals gave off warmth, and barns weren't always separate from living quarters. So, bedtime was less Netflix and chill, more goat and snore. And let's not forget about sleep position. Believe it or not, medieval advice literature sometimes suggested proper ways to lie in bed. Sleeping on your back was seen as risky. It made you vulnerable to nightmares, demons, or just choking on your own snores. Side sleeping was preferred, often the right side, because of, well, digestion theories that make no sense today. Lying on your stomach, practically a sin. Doctors and clergy alike warned against it. So if you're a stomach sleeper, congratulations. You'd have been branded as morally suspicious 5 centuries ago. Dreams, again, carried weight. People consulted dream manuals that offered interpretations. Dreaming of water? Maybe your soul was restless. Dreaming of fire? Possibly divine wrath. Dreaming of your neighbor's cow? Don't worry, there was probably a pamphlet for that too. Dreams weren't random. They were cosmic messages, which added a whole layer of anxiety to bedtime. Not only might you freeze, itch, or accidentally pee on yourself, but your subconscious might also get you labeled as spiritually unhinged. And then, of course, there were the sick. Bedtime was not restful if you were unwell. Remember, hospitals weren't exactly cozy, so a lot of medical care happened in the bedroom. Beds doubled as sick rooms. Doctors visited. Family crowded in. Prayers were said. Sleep was as much about waiting for recovery or death as it was about actual rest. Finally, we can't leave out the rich symbolism of the bed itself. It wasn't just furniture. It was inheritance. Beds were passed down in wills like prized possessions. Owning a bed was proof of wealth. If you had a proper bed, you were doing all right in life. If you didn't, well, good luck with that pile of straw. So, yeah, 500 years ago, bedtime was never just bedtime. It was politics, ritual, social performance, a hygiene nightmare, and sometimes a literal fire hazard. Sweet dreams indeed. So, now that we've peeked into noble bedrooms with their embroidered curtains and their ceremonial sock removals, let's gently wander back down the social ladder. Because, let's be honest, most people weren't royalty. Most people were peasants. And peasant bedtime was a whole different vibe. Picture this, a one-room cottage, smoky from the fire, because chimneys weren't exactly universal yet. The same space had to fit cooking, eating, storage, maybe a few chickens. And of course, the bed, or something pretending to be a bed. For many, that was just a sack stuffed with straw or hay. If you were lucky, you might upgrade to dried moss. Imagine trying to sleep on something that smelled faintly like a damp forest floor. Romantic in theory, scratchy in practice. And that bed, it was not private. Families usually slept all together, either in one large bed or just sprawled across the floor. Parents, kids, maybe grandma. And yes, sometimes the animals too. It wasn't weird. It was survival. Cows and goats radiated heat. So, bedtime could mean drifting off to the sound of your father snoring on one side and a sheep chewing cud on the other. Cozy in its own horrifying way. Children often slept at the foot of the parents' bed or piled in like firewood. Privacy wasn't really a medieval concept, at least not for peasants. And if you're wondering how couples managed intimacy in such close quarters, well, let's just say humans have always been resourceful. It wasn't glamorous, but things got done, quietly, hopefully. Now compare that to the wealthiest households. For nobles and royals, the bed was basically a throne you happened to lie down on. Four-poster beds with velvet hangings, gilded carvings, embroidered sheets. Basically, your entire net worth was woven into your mattress. Beds could even be portable, dismantled, and hauled around when a lord moved from one castle to another. Because apparently, sleeping on a regular mattress was just too peasanty. And nobles didn't just sleep in beds, they performed sleep. A noblewoman in her chamber might have attendants brush her hair, help her change into linen nightclothes, or even warm her feet before she lay down. Meanwhile, her husband might stroll in after a round of heavy drinking, collapse fully clothed, and snore like a human bagpipe. Balance, I guess. And again, the curtains. The rich loved those curtains. They weren't just for warmth. They were about creating a tiny enclosed world. You drew the curtains and suddenly you had privacy, even if there were 5 servants lying nearby on the floor. Curtains were like medieval noise-canceling headphones, except they didn't cancel noise or smell or really anything, but they felt luxurious. One fun detail, in many wealthy houses, guests also shared beds. Hospitality meant making room, literally. If a traveler or visiting relative showed up, you shoved over and let them climb in. Men slept with men, women with women, sometimes strangers with strangers. It wasn't considered scandalous, just practical. And apparently everyone accepted the awkwardness of, "Good night. I guess I'll be breathing on your face for the next 8 hours." Let's drift into night clothes for a moment. Today we have pajamas, sweatpants, or the classic just old t-shirts. Medieval people? Linen shifts were the standard, basically long undershirts. If you were poorer, you might just sleep in whatever you wore during the day, which, considering medieval hygiene, means bedtime came with a side order of crusty socks and eau de sweat. For the wealthy, though, the nightshirt could be a status symbol too, finely woven, embroidered, and definitely not something you'd want near a chamber pot accident. Oh, and speaking of hygiene, nighttime prayers were a big part of the routine. After all, going to bed meant facing the possibility that you might not wake up. Death was casual back then, so prayers were like medieval sleep insurance. If I die before I wake wasn't just a cute nursery rhyme, it was a real nightly concern. People genuinely worried they might not survive the night, whether from illness, fire, or random divine judgment. Sweet dreams, indeed. Now, insomnia was also a thing. They didn't call it insomnia, of course, but medical texts complained about people lying awake, unable to drift off. The advice? Drink warm milk, take a walk, pray harder, or, my personal favorite, rub a concoction of lettuce juice on your forehead. Because nothing says restful sleep like a salad facial. And let's not forget about sleepwalking. Accounts of people wandering around at night pop up in medieval texts, too. Explanations range from the humors are unbalanced to demons are dragging you out of bed. Either way, it wasn't a good look. Imagine stumbling through your cold, dark cottage, stepping into the chamber pot, and getting blamed on Satan. Rough night. Now, in royal courts, bedtime also intersected with politics. Think about it. If you're the king, who gets to see you in your bedclothes? Who tucks you in? Who wakes you up? These weren't just cozy moments. They were signs of power and influence. The king's bedchamber was basically a political office, and the servants who worked there wielded surprising authority. It was like being the personal assistant of a CEO, except the CEO also drooled on his pillow. Beds also served as social stages. Contracts were signed in bed. Gifts were received in bed. Audiences with important visitors could even happen while the Lord was lounging under a blanket. Because if you were rich enough, you didn't need to get up to run a kingdom. You just waved your hand from under the covers and said, "Yes, yes, tell the peasants to stop revolting." And sometimes beds were even symbols of dynastic survival. A noble marriage wasn't just about politics. It was about producing heirs. And if the marriage wasn't producing children, people blamed the bed. Was it too small, too soft, too cursed? Never mind biology. Clearly, the problem was with the furniture. So, bedtime 5 centuries ago wasn't just sleep. It was class distinction in action. For peasants, it meant crowding together for warmth and hoping the thatch roof didn't leak. For nobles, it meant ceremony, symbolism, and way too many embroidered curtains. And somehow both extremes were equally uncomfortable in their own ways. So, you've crawled into your hay mattress, or maybe you've been ceremoniously tucked into a bed draped with fabric worth more than your entire village. Either way, the night is only just beginning, and bedtime in the past was never guaranteed to be quiet, peaceful, or even private. Let's start with the soundtrack of the medieval and early modern night. Forget white noise machines and rain sounds for sleep playlists. You had dogs barking outside, oxen shuffling in the byre, and maybe the sound of your neighbor coughing through thin cottage walls. Add in a chorus of snores, because, apparently, everyone has snored since the dawn of time. And then, of course, the ever-romantic scratching of lice or fleas as they staged an all-night rave in your bedding. Sleep tight. Don't let the bedbugs bite. Yeah, that rhyme was not metaphorical. Then there were bells. Church bells didn't exactly respect bedtime. Monks woke up at intervals throughout the night to chant the canonical hours, and bells reminded everyone else of that fact. Imagine finally drifting off, only to be jolted awake at 2 in the morning by a gong announcing someone else's prayer schedule. Cozy. For peasants, the danger was often more practical. Fires. Homes were heated by open hearths, which had to smolder through the night without burning the place down. Sparks flying from the fireplace into a thatched roof was a medieval version of leaving the oven on. People did their best, covering fires with ash or using heavy lids, but accidents happened. A warm bed might just become a very warm bed. And then, of course, there were thieves. Night was when crime was expected. Towns tried to enforce curfews, locking gates and patrolling streets. But out in the countryside, if someone wanted to sneak into your barn and grab a chicken or two, the darkness helped. For wealthier folk, castles and manor houses had guards, but even they weren't invincible. Night meant vulnerability, which probably didn't help anyone's insomnia. Speaking of insomnia, people in the past didn't sleep in one long block like we try to today. Historians think segmented sleep was common, two separate chunks with a first sleep and a second sleep. You'd doze off for a few hours, wake up around midnight, maybe pray, maybe wander outside to check on animals, maybe sneak in some intimacy. Then, after an hour or two, you'd tuck back in for a second round of sleep until dawn. Sounds impractical today, but it made sense in a world where darkness lasted 10 or more hours and candles were expensive. Now, if you happened to wake up at midnight, what else did you do? Sometimes people read, if they were literate and rich enough to own books. Though, keep in mind, this meant reading by candlelight, which strained the eyes and risked dripping wax on the sheets. Some people journaled or prayed, or they just sat there. Because what else are you going to do at 1 a.m. in a freezing cottage? It was basically the 1500s version of doom scrolling, except instead of Twitter, it was staring at the shadows on the wall and hoping it wasn't a demon. Ah, yes, demons. Night was their playground, at least according to a lot of people. Sleep paralysis was often interpreted as a devil or a witch sitting on your chest. Dreams could be considered divine messages or sinister warnings, and nightmares were blamed on overeating, bad air, or yes, witchcraft. Nothing like blaming your indigestion on a neighbor's hex. But dreams weren't always scary. Sometimes they were diagnostic. Medieval physicians thought dreams could reveal the state of your body. Dream of water? Clearly, you had too much phlegm. Dream of fire? Excess choler? Dream of cheese? Honestly, probably just cheese. But in their world view, your subconscious was a medical chart. And then there were the night visitors. No, not ghosts, though plenty of people believed in those too, but rodents. Mice and rats were a constant bedtime companion, scurrying around floors, gnawing on wood, and sometimes getting bold enough to crawl into beds. You could pull the curtains, but unless you sealed the whole bed like a medieval mosquito net, you might wake up to a whiskered face in the dark. Charming. Even the wealthy had to deal with pests. Fleas didn't care if you were a peasant or a prince. In fact, luxurious feather beds could sometimes be worse. Plenty of soft stuffing meant plenty of hiding places. And when plague came around, those same fleas became tiny little death couriers. So yes, your four-poster bed might look glamorous, but it was also a luxury pest hotel. Now, let's drift gently to midnight snacks. Eating at night wasn't exactly common. Food preservation was limited, and people generally ate earlier. But some texts do mention nibbling on bread or warming up ale or milk to help with sleep. Of course, the line between a remedy and ritual blurred easily. Drink warm beer before bed, sleep soundly. Rub lettuce juice on your temples, drift off. Eat roasted dormouse fat. Yes, that was suggested in some places. You'll sleep like a baby. The history of nighttime snacks is not appetizing. Oh, and speaking of ale, alcohol was often used as a sleep aid. not in the glass of red wine before bed way we think of today, but in the just drink until you pass out sense. For peasants, beer was safer to drink than water anyway, so it wasn't unusual to go to bed mildly tipsy. Nobles had wine, of course, which probably helped dull the noise of their drafty castles and the fact that their bedchamber doubled as a political office. And so the night rolled on. Somewhere in a village, peasants shifted against the hay, hoping the roof didn't leak. In a monastery, monks stirred awake to shuffle to chapel for the night office, chanting psalms while half asleep. And in a royal chamber, a servant listened to the king snore like an overstuffed bellows, all while mentally composing tomorrow's gossip. Sleep 5 centuries ago wasn't just sleep. It was a performance, a ritual, a medical treatment, a cosmic risk, and occasionally a group activity involving livestock. And yet, somehow, everyone managed to wake up and do it all again the next day. So, the night has passed. Somehow, despite the fleas, the rats, the demons, and your neighbor's cow mooing outside, you managed to get some rest. Congratulations. But of course, bedtime only works if you eventually wake up. And mornings 500 years ago had their own set of rituals, none of them exactly Instagram-worthy. First things first, the alarm clock. Spoiler alert, there wasn't one, unless you count church bells again, which never seemed to mind their own business. For peasants, dawn itself was the alarm. Roosters crowing, animals stirring, and light creeping through cracks in wooden shutters. In other words, nature screaming at you to get up and start working. For nobles, mornings could be theatrical. Because if you were wealthy enough, waking up was basically a team sport. Servants entered the bedchamber, sometimes in a specific order, to attend the king, queen, or lord. There were people whose entire job was just to help someone else sit up in bed. Imagine training your whole life, only to be officially titled the Royal Bed Lifter. Glamorous. And remember the bed curtains, those heavy velvet drapes that made the bed into its own tiny stage? Well, mornings meant the great unveiling. Servants swept them back dramatically, letting in light, and waking up the royal body inside like a weird medieval fashion show. Ta-da! The Duke of Burgundy, slightly drooling but alive. Now for the less glamorous detail, chamber pots. Yes, that first morning task was the same then as it is now. People didn't have bathrooms, they had ceramic or metal pots tucked under the bed. In the morning, you, or more likely, some very unlucky servant, took care of the contents. Nobles didn't touch the stuff themselves, of course. That was beneath them, quite literally, since the pot was under the bed. For peasants, it was a do-it-yourself affair. Step outside, dump it somewhere, hope the wind was in your favor. After that, it was time to wash up. Don't picture hot showers or fluffy towels. Morning hygiene often meant a quick splash of cold water on the face and hands. If you were fancy, you got a basin of warmed water poured by a servant. Soap existed, but it wasn't exactly Dove body wash. And brushing teeth, not really a routine yet. People might rub them with a cloth, chew on herbs, or rinse with wine. Because why not start your morning with booze breath? And then came prayers. Religion was woven into every moment of the day, so morning prayers were non-negotiable. Before eating, before working, before basically anything, you had to acknowledge God's role in not smiting you during the night. A common prayer literally thanked him for restoring me to life, because again, death was always hovering close enough to make sleep feel like a gamble. For peasants, Mornings meant getting straight to work, tending animals, fetching water, grinding grain. Breakfast wasn't elaborate. Maybe bread, maybe porridge, maybe ale. Yes, ale again. Morning beer was normal because water could make you sick, but weak ale was safe. And also, who doesn't want to start their 14-hour Labor Day with a buzz? For nobles, mornings began with ceremony. A king or queen didn't just get dressed, they were dressed. Layers of linen, hose, gowns, cloaks, all handled by attendants. Even the order of dressing mattered, and each servant had their rank. You didn't just slap on pants. You had an entire staff ranking system to decide who got to hand you your underwear. Talk about micromanagement. Food for nobles was also more indulgent. Bread and ale, sure, but also meat, cheese, eggs, sometimes even sweet pastries if you were lucky enough to live near a sugar supply. Breakfast might also involve wine, because apparently sobriety before noon was just for peasants. But let's not forget one important detail. Not everyone agreed that breakfast was a good idea. In fact, many medieval doctors and religious writers frowned on it. Eating too early was seen as greedy or even sinful. The ideal was to fast until later in the day. So, if you ate breakfast, it sometimes came with a side of guilt, which honestly feels very modern. Now, what about children? For peasant kids, mornings meant chores before anything else. Feeding chickens, fetching wood, helping with younger siblings. For royal children, mornings were about education. Tutors drilled them in Latin, scripture, and court etiquette, which sounds noble, but really just meant spending your childhood trapped in endless grammar lessons while wearing itchy brocade. Not exactly fun, and through it all, the bedchamber remained a stage. For royals, waking up wasn't private, it was political. Who got access to the king or queen in those first groggy moments of the day could decide the fate of entire kingdoms. Imagine trying to make national policy decisions while still half asleep and drooling into your pillow. Relatable, honestly. So mornings, much like nights, were about survival for peasants and performance for the elite. Both groups started their days with rituals that made sense to them. One group milked cows, the other group milked influence, and both probably wished they could hit snooze if snooze had existed. So, we've lingered through the peasant hay piles, the noble curtain-draped stages, the chamber pots, and the midnight lettuce juice sleep remedies. But bedtime didn't stay frozen 500 years ago. Slowly, over centuries, people started tinkering with how they slept, and bedtime became just a little bit closer to the way we think of it today. Let's start with the furniture. In the early 1500s, most beds were still pretty rustic. Ropes strung across wooden frames with a sack of straw on top. That's actually where the phrase "sleep tight" probably comes from, tightening the ropes so the mattress didn't sag. But over time, things got fancier. Springs appeared, padding improved, and stuffing shifted from straw to feathers or wool. Beds became more comfortable, though not necessarily cleaner. Parasites still loved them. Even the fanciest feather mattress was basically a 5-star resort for lice. Curtains remained popular for centuries, but they slowly became less about survival and more about fashion. In castles and manor houses, by the 1600s and 1700s, bed hangings were increasingly ornamental. They showed off wealth and taste. But fireplaces improved, chimneys got better, and houses weren't quite as smoky or drafty. You didn't need 10 layers of fabric to stop from freezing. So, Eventually, people let the curtains go. Today, they're basically extinct, unless you're reenacting true to life or living in a particularly dramatic Airbnb. Lighting also changed the game. In the 1500s, most people relied on candles, rushlights, or oil lamps. These were dim, flickery, and not exactly ideal for late night reading. But as production improved, candles got cheaper, and by the 1700s, more people could afford to burn them for longer. That meant the night stretched out. People could stay awake later, socialize, or read. Eventually, with gas lamps and electricity, the whole idea of going to bed with the sun fell apart, which is why we now scroll TikTok at 2 a.m. instead of sleeping like sensible medieval farmers. Clothing evolved too. For most of the medieval and early modern period, the standard was still the linen shift or nightshirt. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, specialized nightwear started popping up. Loose gowns, bed caps, even quilted robes for cold nights. Men had long shirts, women had shifts, and everybody looked vaguely like a ghost floating through the hallway. By the Victorian period, pajamas in the modern sense began to spread, borrowed from South and East Asian styles. So, the next time you pull on your flannel PJS, you can thank global trade routes for making bedtime less drafty. Another slow change, cleanliness. In the 1500s, people didn't change sheets very often. Washing linens was labor-intensive, and soap wasn't always handy. Beds could go months before being stripped. Yes, months. Try not to think too hard about it. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, laundering became more frequent, especially in wealthier households. The rise of cotton as a fabric made sheets cheaper, easier to wash, and, bonus, less itchy than coarse medieval linen. Slowly, bedtime started to smell a little fresher, and with all of this came changes in sleep itself. That two sleeps pattern we talked about earlier? It started to fade as artificial lighting extended evenings. People went to bed later and got up later, compressing their sleep into a single block. Doctors also began recommending regular sleep as a health practice, pushing against the segmented model. So, ironically, the modern obsession with 8 solid hours is relatively new. For most of history, waking up at midnight was just part of the plan. Of course, superstition clung on for a while. Dreams were still taken seriously as omens well into the 18th century. Witches were still blamed for nightmares, and even as science marched forward, plenty of people still swore by weird remedies for sleeplessness. Everything from warm beer to rubbing puppy fat on your temples, which please don't try at home or anywhere. By the 19th century, the whole bedroom aesthetic shifted. Private bedrooms became more common, especially in middle-class homes. No more entire families stacked like cordwood in a single bed. Privacy, at last, was something ordinary people could aspire to. Bedrooms were decorated, personalized, made cozy. Bedtime became less about survival and more about comfort. And so, here we are today, sliding into memory foam mattresses, scrolling glowing rectangles, and complaining about how hard it is to fall asleep even though our ancestors would have killed for a quiet, pest-free bed with central heating. The truth is, bedtime 500 years ago was never simple. It was ritual, survival, politics, medicine, superstition, and occasionally just lying still with a goat pressed against your side for warmth. From hay sacks to feather beds, from candlelight to LED screens, sleep has always been a little weird, a little messy, and never quite as restful as we'd like. So as you dim your own lights and maybe pull a blanket a little tighter, you're not so different from those medieval peasants or those velvet-draped royals. Everyone, at some point, has just wanted to close their eyes and escape the noise of the day, even if the noise was cows, chamber pots, and the sound of monks chanting in the distance. And with that, I think it's time to let this story drift to a close. Because really, the only proper way to end a history of bedtime is to say good night.